Are you a reader looking for a good book? Or are you an author who has written a book? Good Books Online is the show that brings readers and authors together.
Well, here we are with another episode of Good Books Online, and today we have Larry Steele, who's written a book called As I Recall. Now, what exactly are you recalling, Larry?
A whole bunch of stuff. I came up with the title because after every paragraph through my life for all those years, I seem to either start or finish it with As I Recall.
Yeah. But I mean, it's part biography, but most importantly, it's kind of like your exploration of the early history of rock and roll and Southern rock. And as a matter of fact, you played with a bunch of the people that would eventually become the legends of Southern rock and roll.
Exactly right. Yeah, it is autobiographical. And it starts from my very first band that I started with Alan Collins, who, of course, we all know as the lead guitarist of Lynyrd Skynyrd.
Mm-hmm.
He and I formed our first band together at like age 12. And
Before you were old enough to get into most of the clubs you'd be playing at, right?
Yeah, exactly. We had to sneak in to see the other bands just to get an idea of what we were trying to do. So, yeah, it started from there, and then the whole story, it just goes through basically every band that I played with or worked with, right through from 1964 through 1987 when I ended up. I was working with 38 Special at that time.
Yeah, and the funny thing is I remember reading the book, and it starts off with even your history before that, because you actually started touring when you were 6. So explain to people about that. That was kind of an interesting story.
Well, because one of my aunts was very influential in my life, and she always encouraged me. I love to travel, and she knew that, and she encouraged me to travel, and she encouraged me in music. And my dad had several buddies that were very good friends that were they were all Greyhound bus drivers.
Right.
So they would have what you call deadhead runs to pick up soldiers or whatever from various places, and wherever we had relatives in that area, they would put me on the bus with the driver, and here we go. Yeah. And I'd end up spending a month or two in Georgia, Richmond Hill, Georgia, and then over in Blackman, Florida, and Pensacola area, and just wherever we had relatives.
So it's kind of like basic training for a musician, right?
Exactly.
Because, you and I both know that, especially in Jacksonville, musicians don't get paid very well. This is kind of where you start putting together your bands, but when you really want to make some money, you've got to tour.
Exactly. You got to get out on the road, and you got to find the money, and, you're more valuable to people that aren't so familiar with you.
Right. Now, one of the things I liked about your book was the fact that you started talking about the way that once the British invasion hit, the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and everything, then you really got interested in music all of a sudden, along with the rest of the country. But unlike the rest of the country, you decided at that point that you'd rather be those guys than just watch them on TV.
Exactly. Well, a lot of us already had a keen interest in music. I myself, that same aunt, she would take me to see the R&B groups and
right.
everything. So I was greatly influenced by James Brown and the Coasters and people like that in concert. But then when we got into the Beach Boys, I was a big fan of the Beach Boys. So that's when we really started wanting to play, when hearing stuff like Surfer Girl on 409 and stuff like that. But when the Beatles came out, then there was just no getting around it.
Right.
Then you had to do it. It's time to go to your dad, tell him you need some money. I need a guitar. Here we go.
Yeah, and actually you started off with the bass.
I did.
Tell them about your first bass.
My first bass was a Kent single pickup, cost I think $108.
Which of course was a lot of money back then.
Yeah, it was a lot of money. It was it was your learner model,
right.
But it was my dad kept he took me to one of his pawn shop buddies. He was trying to sell me on a better quality bass, but the bass was bigger than I was, and at that point, when you're 12, it's a lot more about looking cool than it was.
Sure.
Having a quality instrument. So that one was more to my size.
Right.
It was a solid body. It looked more electric, so I went with the cheap one.
So what was your first band?
My first band was the Mods.
And how old were you when you formed that band?
12.
Right.
Yeah, that was with Alan Collins, and the lead guitarist was Donnie Ulsh, great guitarist, and our drummer's name was James Rice. Alan ironically refused. He didn't want to play lead guitar. He had no aspirations for being the guy out front. He just wanted to play rhythm guitar. And of course, that obviously changed with years to come. But that was my first
You
band.
talked him into it, huh?
Well, Ronnie Van Zant talked him into it.
We're going
You're
to talk
play
about
lead
Ronnie.
guitar.
Yeah. That was a little bit later in the story.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the funny thing about the early story was kind of funny about how the first time that you guys went out and somebody heard you at a club and they loved you and then they found out how old you were and they're like, I'm sorry, you can't play here.
Yeah, come back in a couple of years. Yeah, the club owner said, basically said, the girls will eat them alive and the guys will kill them. So they're too young. Bring them back in a couple of years, and 2 years later,
You came back.
We were back.
Yeah.
We were back. Yeah.
So what happened? What was the difference? But what happened in those 2 years? Because obviously that was the formative time of your early music career.
Well, a lot of things happened in those 2 years. One is Alan went to another band.
Right.
That's when he hooked up with Gary and Bob and Ronnie. And he was with another band, but they still couldn't settle on a bass player. They had a bass player who was pretty good and a great guy, but sometimes he didn't show up. And so I would play bass for them, even though they were my competition then. There's a little friction there after Alan left me to go with Ronnie, but whenever they needed a bass player, we were still buddies, so I was the bass player.
One of the other stories I liked in the book was the time that you decided to upgrade your audio system by stealing a microphone.
Yeah.
And then turned out it wouldn't plug into your system.
It had an XLR connector, a low impedance connector, and we didn't know what that was at the time.
You found out though, right?
Yeah, I had to find out. Yeah. Under fire, yes, we had to find out. So rock and roll, yeah, it was a learning experience. Everything you did, right or wrong, you were going to learn something from it.
It was a wild ride, huh?
Yes, it was. One I enjoyed immensely.
Well, yeah, you've been at it a long time, and you've met a lot of the people that would eventually become legends, like we were talking about Ronnie Van Zant.
Yeah.
What was your first impression of him when you first met him? And how old were you at the time?
Ronnie I met in 1966, so I would have been 14. We had a battle of the bands. Our band was called the Mods. And
Right.
There was another band in school. They were a grade ahead of us. They were called the Squires. And the school arranged a battle of the bands. The Squires was led by a guy named Rick Dashler, who's still out there playing today in the Jacksonville area, good buddy of mine. Anyway, Rick had this band called the Squires, and we were competing against them in the Battle of the Bands. Well, we had the battle at Lakeshore Junior High School. The Mods beat them. We won, and we were very proud of that. And a couple of months later, they decided to have a rematch.
Okay.
The same two bands.
All right.
But I hear from my girlfriend at the time, whose brother was the drummer of the Squires, that there's some changes made. They were changing the name to Us, and they added a lead singer named Ronnie Van Zant. And I'm going, what? I mean, I knew the name Ronnie Van Zant, but it sure wasn't from being a singer or anything to do with music. Ronnie was a street tough. He
Yeah,
was
tough
a
guy.
street fighter, and
Of course, that's not a bad thing to have when you're in these clubs and people are drinking alcohol, right?
no, that comes in handy later on. But at the time, I'm told, the first thing I'm told about this new Battle of the Bands is I get a message from one of the girls that work in the office. She comes in and hand delivers me this message. It says, Ronnie Van Zant wants to meet you behind the cafeteria after school today. And I'm going, maybe this guy doesn't understand how this battle thing works.
Yeah, it's a literal battle.
So I didn't know what to expect, but long story short, he was a great guy. He was nice as he could be. He was a gentleman. He was very soft-spoken, and he was just there to see what he was up against. This was his first singing gig,
Right.
and he wanted to know, what to expect. What's the building going to sound like? Where are we going to set up? And this and that. And so I showed him around the school and how it was going to go. And next thing he knew, they'd sold so many tickets, they had to move it to Forest High School,
Yeah.
to the gymnasium there. And they won that one. But that was something we argued about. Alan and I and Ronnie argued about that for years, for many years, about that. They were both rigged.
Yeah.
They were both very good.
That's the way it usually works, right?
The first battle, we were both bands were terrible, and we somehow won. The second time, both bands were really good, and,
Right.
and they won. And that was all Ronnie. You know, he was the in the first battle of the bands, we were the guys from the wrong side of the tracks.
Right.
But then they got the ultimate guy from the wrong side of the tracks, the older guy with the longer hair and the, you know, yeah, it was him.
But after that, you guys became good friends.
Oh, absolutely.
And in fact, you also
We were still good friends then while we
Yeah.
were battling, but yeah, we got to be very good friends.
and more importantly, he didn't beat you up, so that was a good.
That's right, he never did. He had a couple of chances, a couple of opportunities, but he never did, and I appreciate that very much.
One of the things I also liked about your book, I mentioned Ronnie Van Zant, you also mentioned Donnie and the Sons of Satin.
Sons of Satan. It had to be spelled Satin because Sister Van Zant,
Right.
their
Who
mom
does he fit?
would not
Couldn't put the A in
sign
there.
off. Would not sign off on the Satan thing. No, she wasn't having that. So they had to spell it with Satin. But
I thought that was funny.
yeah,
I also thought it was really kind of interesting when I was reading through the book because you mentioned some of the other names of the bands that were back then, which was kind of interesting, like the Mailbox, BACHS, and
Right.
the Bitter End.
IND. Right?
Yeah, and one of the things I really liked was how Lynyrd Skynyrd actually got its name because of Coach Lynyrd Skynyrd. You want to tell our listeners about that story? 'Cause that was kind of an interesting story in itself.
Well, that that story's been around for a long time, but yeah, I'll tell it. Coach Skinner was a coach at Lee High School,
Mhm.
and at Lee High School in particular, most of the high schools, but particularly at Lee, you weren't allowed to have long hair or
Right.
anything that they thought you were trying to draw attention to
Mhm.
yourself.
He was like the crew cut king, right?
Right. The only people that had long hair in those days were the musicians, so we took it as a personal
Affront, right?
affront to the musicians.
Sure.
But anyway, one thing about that, yeah, Gary seemed to keep getting in trouble with Coach Skinner. But what made that, Coach Skinner was not, truth be known, was not the horrible person that everybody that he
Right.
was made out to be. The other coaches were a lot worse than
Mhm.
Skinner, actually. Now, he did his job. He did that, too. He enforced the laws,
Sure.
too. But the thing about Skinner was the old song, Hello Mudda, Hello Fada.
Mhm.
There was a character in there named Lynyrd Skynyrd who contracted ptomaine poisoning
Right.
while at camp. Well, that was a big thing that Alan Collins got into. He sang that song religiously all the time, and Bob Burns just loved the Lynyrd Skynyrd thing. He couldn't leave it alone. So when Gary comes home saying, got kicked out of school again today, Coach Skinner, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Bob would just have a blast with that name, Lynyrd Skynyrd, and it just kept going on and on until, Bob was kind of chanting around the dining room table one day at one of their rehearsals. I
Right.
was sitting there, and he's going, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Lynyrd. We ought to change the name to Lynyrd Skynyrd. And we just laughed, we thought, well,
Yeah.
that's hilarious. That's surprisingly enough, Alan told me a couple of days later that Wicker, Ronnie, they called him Wicker, liked the idea. And they were really going to do it. So that shocked me. But the next thing you knew, they changed the name.
And the rest is history, right?
And the rest is history. It sure is.
Well, and that's what's interesting about the books. I mean, really, we've only covered a fraction of the book. By the way, here's the book. It's available. You can buy it on Amazon. You can also read some excerpt chapters and click on the link to it and find out a little more about Larry Steele on goodbooks.online.
Right. And on my, there's excerpts here. Also on my Facebook page, as I recall, there are excerpts there. And updates as to, different places you can buy it. There are, a couple of stores around town. There's a bar that sells the book. So we'll keep you updated on there as to different places you can get it. Barnes & Noble advertises that they have it in stock, as does BAM, but I've never talked to anybody that actually went in and walked out with a copy. They usually have to wait a couple of days. But
All right. And I want to thank you again for joining us on our little show here. And What we're going to do next for you people that are on the YouTube channel is we're going to bring in our writer's stuff expert this week, which is going to be Cheyenne Knopf, who is into the book printing business. So anyway, until next week, keep reading good books, folks. Thanks.